Hello, happy Monday. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. This is the first day of Native Prairie Appreciation Week. My name is Mroz-Sailer, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or SKPCAP. Today, Dr. Troy McMullin, a research scientist in lichenology research and collections at the Canadian Museum of Nature, will be speaking about adventures in lichenology. I'm personally really excited about today's webinar, and it's come back to us after popular demand, so we're really excited to have Troy back on here. But before we get going, I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they've worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. And before we begin, I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with prairie conservation or species at risk. But special for Native Prairie Appreciation Week, we will be having a presentation tomorrow about the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, a hub of prairie research and collections at 12 p.m. And we'll also host a webinar on July 30th about Red Berry Lake Biosphere Region Update. So you can register for these webinars on the PCAP website. And most of our past webinar presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel. A reminder to our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar, but just type it into the Q&A section or the chat section of the webinar dashboard anytime. If you're on a cell phone, you can send your question by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and SaskTel. Also, Sask Energy is the sponsor of our Native Prairie Appreciation Week. And in-kind support has been provided by the Canadian Museum of Nature. I'm really pleased to introduce today's presenter. Dr. Troy McMullin is a research scientist in lichenology at the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa. His research program is focused on lichen biodiversity and conservation in Canada. He has published hundreds of articles in popular media and scientific journals, along with 5 books on lichens, one of which was recently released. So with that, I'll pass it over to Troy.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. I'm just going to share my screen before we get started. Okay. Is that looking good?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me back again. It's great to see lichens getting their due in the prairies. My job is to study lichens throughout Canada, and the prairies are one of the areas that I haven't spent much time in, and neither has very many other people, but they're a really important part of the ecosystem there, and they're giving them attention is definitely worth their due. So before we get started, I'd like to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we're not talking about werewolves or anything else. What exactly is a lichen? So I think most people know it as a relationship between a fungus and a photosynthesizing partner, an algae. And that was actually just when the two come together and form a stable body. This is what the International Association of Lichenologists called it in the past, called lichens. And now it's gotten a little more complicated. Some of you, if you've been up on any kind of lichen news, may have heard there's been some media attention around lichens being more complex, and they're a group of organisms working together, and more we're hearing about the microbiome, which includes multiple fungi, not just the main one that makes up the bulk of what you see. It includes bacteria. That's all part of the process. It's this combination of multiple things working together, and it's a lot like humans. I mean, there's bacteria that we have, and there's fungi that we have that are essential for us to function, and all organisms. And so when you really dig into any organisms, it gets kind of messy and blurry, and So this is sort of a simplified version of what I'm talking about. So lichens are the bulk of a lichen. When you see a lichen, it's a fungus. The bulk of what you're seeing, 80 to 95%, is just a single fungus forming the bulk of it. Fungus usually lives in soil, in wood. When you see a fruiting body, that's just, when you see a mushroom, it's just a fruiting body popping up. The bulk of it is usually within a substrate. But when they become lichenized, they're working together with something that's photosynthesizing. So they're getting their energy from this photosynthesizing partner. Usually it's an algae. Sometimes it's a cyanobacterium. And sometimes it's both an alga and a cyanobacterium and the main fungus. And when they all combine together with a microbiome, they form something that can now live on the surface, outside of the wood, outside of the soil. And they're like a self-contained little packet. And we recognize that as a lichen. So this association, just to point out how remarkable it is, here's the fungi kingdom right at the very top, and algae is relatively close nearby, but cyanobacteria is really far away. So it's these things working together in a symbiotic union. In fact, the word symbiosis was created for lichens. It's multiple species working together. And sometimes people classify them as fungi that has imprisoned or is sort of farming the algae. They're more in control. Another way to look at it is that they're both benefiting. They're both living in places they wouldn't be able to otherwise. And this isn't a new phenomena. There's fossil records going back over 600 million years ago that shows fungi and cyanobacteria, or fungi and algae working together, not necessarily in like the lichens we know today, but there are lots of fossil records of the lichens we know today going back 65 million years ago. So it's a long-standing relationship that these things have, and it's also wasn't just one freak occurrence where this happened and then everything radiated out from it. In fact, it's happened where we've seen the lichenized condition happen independently more than 12 times, which is incredible. So they obviously get along really easily and really well. So another way to look at it is, are we talking about species here? Or are we talking about ecosystems? If we were talking about species, you can challenge that by saying, well, it's just, there are these organisms working together. Should it be a species or should it be more of an ecosystem? If you were to take usually when we study lichens, what's different about every species, the photobiont or the algae is often the same in different lichens, but the fungus is always different. So if you generated a DNA sequence of the fungus and a DNA sequence of the free living fungus, not lichenized, you're going to get the same answer, and it's going to get a little bit blurry. So is it more appropriate to maybe look at them as ecosystems? But then you start saying, well, we have these things in our bodies as well. And for now, it's working out to call them species because the vast majority of organisms or vast majority of fungi that have become lichenized no longer live in a free living state that we know of. And so this problem really has to be dealt with. So it's pretty amazing that they were more successful as lichens, and so we don't run into the problem of having them. But there are some species that we do know grow free living and lichenized. So what do they look like? Lichens come in this vast array of shapes and sizes and forms. I like to call them the coral reefs of the natural world because they're just like coral reefs. They're extremely sensitive. They come in a wide range of colors and shapes and sizes, and they're fantastic and wonderful, but they're relatively small for the most part, and unfortunately, often overlooked. So here's just a range of the colors and shapes. They can be extremely small, like the lichens on the left here. These are called the pin or stubbles, and they're only about 1 millimeter tall, versus some of the more abundant ones, like the reindeer lichens growing on the right, which can grow like 1/2 foot deep and grow for hundreds of kilometers uninterrupted in the boreal and feed herds of hundreds of thousands of caribou. So the most leaf-like or foliage-like forms of lichens are called foliose. There's three primary forms that we like to group lichens into. And there's no doubt that when Linnaeus first looked at lichens, not knowing what they were, would have been looking at these ones when he said, lichens are, he called them lower plants. And interestingly, they've always, initially, we didn't know what they were. We didn't know that they were fungi and algae working together. And they were kind of lumped in with botany. And that's the reason that I work at the Museum of Nature in the botany department with all these other botanists, not mycologists. All the federal mycologists work for the Department of Agriculture. And that's for a historical, like, this is not unique. It's the case in most places. And that's because Linnaeus first didn't know what to do with them. He said, okay, these things look like leafy plants. So he called them lower plants. So it's the foliose form. The next form are the fruticose ones. These ones are hairy, leafy, branchy, bushy. The big thing about them is that they're the same on all sides, where the foliose ones are different on the upper and lower surface. The last form is crustose. So these are ones where they have no lower surface. They actually grow into their substrate. So they become one with the bark, with the soil, with whatever they're growing on. The hyphae actually grow in, like if they're growing on a hard granite rock, the hyphae of the fungus will actually grow in between the minerals in the rock and on an extremely micro scale and become so adhered to it that the only way to study these things is to actually chip a piece of the rock. If you try to scrape them off or anything, you're just going to get a pile of dust. And you can imagine then that this is the group that has been the least studied in the lichenological world. It's also known as the micro-lichens. And so there's still lots to discover about these species. So this is what it looks like when lichens with an algal partner get wet. They become bright green. And so do all lichens. They become transparent on the upper surface. So even the ones that are orange or yellow become greener because they get wet, and you can actually see the layer of algae inside, and it's photosynthesizing. So lichens are active when they're wet and receiving light. So lichen growth is based on the amount of time they receive light while wet. If they're not in those conditions, they can kind of just shut down and almost be in like a hibernation type state. And it's one of the reasons they can be so successful in the prairies. Those with cyanobacteria look a little different. They're always darker in color, usually a bluish or brownish, sometimes pure black. And when they get wet, this is an example of the cyanolichens, those with cyanobacteria. And then there's those, we call them tripartite lichens, which have both. So this one has a green algae, so it's wet, showing green algae, and then it's got little cephalodia, which have cyanobacteria in them. So the vast majority of lichens are in the group Ascomycota in the order. These are the disc fungi. So you might question, yeah, so you're saying these things are all fungus, so where's the gills? Where's the gilled mushrooms that should be associated with them? And it's because the bulk of them are Ascomycotas, or the cup fungi. So they do produce fruiting bodies. And these are like little mushrooms, essentially, little cups that produce spores, and they shoot off those spores, and those spores fly around. And when they land, they have to find the other partner that they can grow on. And they also have to find the microbiome, the right bacteria, like all the pieces have to be there, and it has to be in the right environment. And so you can imagine that it'd be really difficult for it to happen. But when you start to imagine, if you walk around the prairies in an undisturbed area, you're going to see lichens everywhere. So all of those partners are available. So in a large part of the time, those spores will fly and land on other lichens and germinate. And that's how they get all the partners. And then you end up with these rocks. For example, you can get a boulder just covered with all kinds of different species, and they're kind of fighting for space on there. And that's why the more lichens you have in an area, the more photobionts are available and the more species. So I like to just describe that whole process as the lichens like to hang out together. So you might get a rock that's bare, there's nothing on the rock, and then the next one might be covered, and that's because they like to hang out together. However, there are some basidiomycotas, ones with the classic gills, And this is an example of one of the more beautiful ones. The body of this lichen is the green bubbly thallus, and it's called the Arctic scale lichen. And the fruiting body is the mushroom that's sticking up. But they're very, very few and far between. In Ontario, where I'm from, there's 1,100 species of lichens, and 3 of them are Basidium lycotis. So it's not very common. So the lichens are ecologically, they're poikiohydric, which means they're unable to retain water. So they're like little sponges. They just suck in the water that comes in like a sponge, and then they slowly release it. And it's not even that slow. They dehydrate and dry up and hydrate and dry up. That's their cycle on a regular basis. And part of the reason that they do this is because they're getting their minerals and nutrients directly from the atmosphere, directly from the water that washes over them. So just like coral, they're just kind of eating what's washing by, and that's part of that sponge-like behavior. And they need to be able to suck that all in and then release the water and get the nutrients. So some other interesting aspects of lichens that make them so successful in ecosystems like the prairies, where they're fully exposed to the sun, right? Like perpetually, year long. Like they don't change throughout the year at all. They change. You can look at them in the middle of winter or the middle of summer, and they're going to look the same. And so one of the ways that they can live this way is because of the chemicals they produce. So lichens produce over 150 molecules or chemicals that are exclusive to lichens. Here are 2 common ones that are produced in the prairie species. One is usnic acid, this light yellowish green color, and the other is an anthraquinone. In this case, it's telocystin, and it's making it orange. So those chemicals can act as sunscreens. They can act in many different ways, many of which we don't understand yet. We also don't know what they could do for humans. This one on the left, this one is very common in the prairies, has usnic acid. Usnic acid is known throughout the world to be antibacterial. It has antibacterial properties, and people around the world have been using it for time, like for a long time before, as a medicine. There's actually been a product produced called usno, which is a lot like polysporin, where they were using it as an antibacterial cream. So who knows what these molecules could do for us, for humans, right? So just another reason, if we need one, if the fact that lichens aren't intrinsically valued when it comes to conservation or priorities, this alone is, what could all of these molecules do? One of the molecules in lichens has been shown to have positive effects on Alzheimer's. And we're still at the very beginning of understanding what these chemicals might be able to do. Here are some uses which are often related to those chemicals. The one on the left has been used for jellies, for breads, for perfumes. It's actually used on an industrial scale for making perfumes. The one in the middle, the brown one here, has been used for soups and breads. This one on the right has the same chemical that I mentioned, has antibacterial properties. And then this one down on the bottom right, this one was used as it's called the wolf lichen, because in Scandinavia it was used to poison wolves and foxes that were feeding on livestock. It was ground up with glass and put into meat to feed. And so it was an easy access point for this chemical into the wolves and foxes. And but it's also used as a dye. It makes an incredible yellow dye, and for medicine. Here are some examples of the different colors you can get from lichens. This is just wool that's been dyed with each of those respective species. And here's another one. This is a common one in the prairies that was, well, I just wanted to tell an interesting story about this one. This one, it's in the prairies pretty commonly on boulders and rocks that are out in the open. It's a nitrophile, so it likes bird droppings, and so it's a great indicator of where birds are roosting. In the Arctic, it's often used to identify those roosts for hunting. And this lichen was, like, numerous individuals of this lichen were brought to the International Space Station and put out into space. Like, all the lack of oxygen and lack of like all the pressure and radiation of space, and left out there for a year and a half. And they were brought back to Earth, and the majority of them, like 80%, just started to just were healthy and fine and kept going again. Here's just a bunch of examples of animals that use lichens as food that have been recorded, and that use them as nesting materials. And so it's pretty widespread. Some of the more popular ones are things like caribou, which actually rely on lichens all winter long. Like, that's their primary food source. Most of these other animals have just been seen eating them. And then nests, there are some animals that make their nests exclusively with lichens, and it's very important. Others just sort of have it as extra material. So I went through and thought, okay, well, what are the ecological functions for lichens in the prairies themselves? And so I sort of went through some of the major ecological functions that are known and how they would apply to the prairies. So the first is camouflage. There's lots of insects everywhere that camouflage to look insects. And so here's a couple of examples, not necessarily from the prairies, but you can see how they're blending in with lichens. Lots of animals make nesting material out of them. This is an example here of a plover in the Arctic, the American plover, that makes its nest out of this white lichen that you can see around there. In the prairies, I couldn't find any examples specifically, but I don't think that's largely that could be because we don't know. For food, there's going to be lots of insects. There's going to be other animals that are eating lichens in the region. They're really important for nutrient exchange. One of the most important in many ecosystems, particularly ecosystems that are low in nitrogen. And it's the ones with cyanobacteria. They can actually fix nitrogen. Like, there aren't many things out there that can fix nitrogen. So these cyanolichens can fix it and wash nitrogen into the soil, and they can actually be an important contributor to nitrogen in the soil. They're also important for soil formation. They can help break down rock. They can help like new exposed rock to soil to build up. They can provide texture on rock, so soil can build up on a lichen, so other things can grow, other seeds can grow. So that's equally as important as the breakdown process. It's a very slow, long process we're talking about here, but they are part of soil formation. In the prairies, it's probably the most important ecological function for lichens would be erosion control. So when you have exposed soil, and to prevent it from washing away, lichens grow on the surface and they form a crust. They're a really important part of the biocrusts that are growing on the surface. And they're very sensitive too in that condition. And that's why in many areas that are disturbed, where there's been lots of cattle, where there's been agriculture, you're going to see this damage. And it takes a long time for lichens to colonize and a long time for them to grow. And then there's also the water retention. So when water flows through a habitat, they're little sponges. So they're soaking in the water and then they're releasing that moisture slowly. Like if the water is washing away, the lichens will still be holding onto it for a certain amount of time. So what do we know about lichens in the prairies? It's one of the areas of Canada that has not been studied very well. But we do have some interesting historical records. So John McMullin was the first national botanist in Canada, who effectively had my position in the 1800s, but he collected everything. He collected all botanical plants, but he was also a prolific collector of lichens. And he had 5 botanical expeditions through the prairies in the 1800s. And so we have all that material here at the museum. And so it provides a great baseline for what species were there, and we can use that to compare with what species are there. So interestingly as well, one of the parks, the Grasslands National Park, is one of the parks that has been studied really well for lichens. This is a map of all the national parks in Canada. And all the ones with red circles are the ones that have been studied well, all the national parks in Canada that have been studied well for lichens and have a published lichen list. And the ones that are circled in orange, there's 7 of them that have partial, like some collecting has been done there. Some notes have been published, but it's not really comprehensive in any kind of way. And that's it. So there's 35 of 48 national parks, but we really don't know much. Like there might be some internal reports, but we don't know that there's no published records of the lichens in these parks. So this kind of gives you an idea of how well lichens are known throughout Canada. And so it's kind of interesting. We do actually have a good study now. This one that was done in Grasslands. This was done by Colin Freeberry. He's a research associate here at the museum. And he went out there for years to learn about that ecosystem. And he found an incredible number of species that were new to Canada and new to Saskatchewan. In total, he found 194 species. So how does that compare to lichens in general? Globally, the last time they were enumerated they were almost 20,000. That number changes by the day. New species are discovered all the time. Species are lumped, so it fluctuates, but you get an idea. We've got about 20,000 global lichens. In Canada, there's about 2,400 species. In Saskatchewan, based on the published record, there are, that's published and database records, there's about 550. And that is definitely a low number. It's not an accurate number whatsoever. There's still lots of work that needs to be done. If you compare that number to Ontario, let's say, which has 1,100 species, this is half, and that's not accurate. Like there's the number of species that would be in the prairies that are different from the boreal. It's just that a lot of work hasn't been done for lichens in the prairies at all. So in grasslands, 194 species. In terms of what we know about rare species in the prairies, if you're not familiar with how we sort of recognize rare species in Canada, there's 2 ways we do recognize them with non-legal protection, and those are S ranks, which are subnational, national, and then global ranks. These are set by NatureServe and conservation data centers. And they'll give ranks that don't have any protection, but they help us to identify the lichens that should be, or any species that should be given attention and focus. There's global ranks as well through the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they also just help bring attention to rare species. In terms of legal protection, there's provincial governments can set legal protection for lichens. There are none in Saskatchewan that I know of. Federally, we have about 20 to 25 species have been assessed across the country. The vast majority of them are in the coastal regions. There's only 1 species in the prairies that is on that has been assessed by a CSIWIC and is on the Species at Risk Act. And that's the golden eye lichen, or Teleschistes chrysophthalmus. It's really a prairie species. You can see here, it's creeping into the southern parts of Manitoba. And in the prairie boreal population, it's listed as special concern. I wanted to highlight this species as well from the prairies. This is Xanthoparmelia chlorocroa. This is an interesting species because it's like a vagabond. It's like a tumbleweed. It kind of just blows around in the prairies. It'll get caught on things and start growing. But a really beautiful and spectacular species. And it's the unofficial lichen of Saskatchewan. During COVID, I started an initiative to try to get. It was based on 2 things. California recently adopted or established an official lichen for like a state lichen, and then the bird for Canada, we had a vote for a national bird. We still don't have that, but I was inspired by those two things to say, okay, let's do this for Canada for lichens. This was during COVID. We were trying to do some outreach programs, and I didn't really think a lichen would get listed, but at least we could educate about them. And so I just contacted colleagues and lichenologists across the country in each province and territory and said, try to come up with a way to, work with each province and territory to come up with an emblem. And this was the one selected for Saskatchewan. So it's an unofficial one, but interestingly, this was an initiative done over COVID. And last year, one of them was made official. It was the one in Nova Scotia. It was turned into we now have an official emblem for a province in Canada, and that's for Nova Scotia. And maybe we could have one for Saskatchewan too, but it would take locals, talking to members of parliament and to be willing to take something to the table, through a private member's bill. I also did a national one at the same time. This is Cladonia stellaris, and there was over 20,000 people voted on this from across the country and selected this lichen to be our national lichen. So I thought to conclude, I would go through some of the prairie, some just different prairie lichens and say a few things about them, what you're seeing out there. Sometimes it can be hard to tell the difference between a lichen and a fungus, a moss, a liverwort, a hornwort. How do you separate all of these? And for the most part, lichens are the pastel colors. They're very bright. And that's your first clue. The second is that they're growing on top of the surface. So they're really just like a unit, an individual makes like a clear outline. Whereas fungi will often grow inside of something. It'll grow inside a piece of wood, and the little pieces of the fungi will pop out as fruiting bodies, and they'll be very irregular and scattered, where lichens are usually a nice unit. They'll be individual units, but it's clearly a unit, clearly growing on top of the substrate. And if you're not sure if it's a fungus or a lichen or a fungus or a moss, they're also little sponges, like I said. So when you feel them when they're dry, they're hard and they're crunchy, and a lot of them reproduce that way. If they break off, little bits of them will break off, and that's how new lichens grow. Often is through vegetative reproduction. And so that's one way to tell them apart, is that when they're hard and crumbly when they're dry, if you add a little bit of water, they just absorb it like a sponge and then become soft. There's a really extreme change. Like if you add water to dry moss, it'll expand and grow, but it doesn't go from really, really hard and crispy to like really soft and malleable like a sponge. And same with fungus. If it's a fungus, it's usually, you can get a wet fungus. If you add water, nothing changes. The texture usually stays the same. You can get a dry fungus. If you add water to it, that doesn't usually change it either. So it's that real change, the pastel colors. And if you really wanted to be sure, you could actually scrape some of it off and see the layer inside of algae or of cyanobacteria. And that's really clear as well. So in the prairies, you get species growing on the shrubs, you get species growing on the soil, and you get species growing on rocks. Those are the primary groupings for substrates. And so these little rock outcrops like this, these little boulders, that's a great place to go and look for lichens in the prairies. Here's a great example of the Xanthoparmelia chlorocroa getting caught in this little nook here with all kinds of other lichens. This bright orange one is called Xanthomendoza trachyphylla, and you can see other lichens growing there. I think if you can see my arrow, this is probably lichen here. There's brown at the bottom. There's a different white one here. There's a little yellow one here. And there's a different one. This is golden moonglow, which we'll see in a second there. This is another lichen. So there's a big community here. There's probably 20 species if we looked at all the different species in a little nook like this. This is a common one there as well that grows on the soil. It's the soil one. It makes these little rosettes and then makes little pixie cups with these little plates inside. This is called rosette pixie cup lichen. And there's another pixie cup lichen just like it, but it doesn't make, which also grows in the prairies, but it does not make those rosette-like growth forms. This is a common one on rocks in the prairies. And one of the more difficult ones, once you really get into lichens, you'll see that there's a lot of them, these micro lichens or crust lichens that grow, and they're just little black dots. And like you can pick up a pebble in the prairies and there'll be little black dots all over it. And it might be 3 different species, 4 different species. And some of them you don't know until you actually cut them open and look at the spores, look at the internal structures. Like even here, we're seeing this main one that I highlighted, but there's a little yellow one here. And there's a little orange one. There's some down here. That's a completely different species. There's a lot going on, especially at a micro scale, on the rocks, on the soil, on all substrates. This is candle flame lichen or Candelaria concolor. This one's a tiny, tiny foliose lichen, and it grows on bark and wood in the prairies. And when you see it from a distance, it just looks, it's so small. It looks like just a pale yellow background. And it's not really obvious until you get in there and you look closely. And you go, and it actually comes to life. It's these little tiny lobes. Another one that grows on bark and wood and twigs and in the prairies is hooded sunburst lichen, Xanthomedosa phalanx. And you can see it here growing with the yellow one that I just pointed out, which is a lot smaller, that little tiny candle flame lichen growing in amongst it. Another common one is Lichenology impudens, and it's this white crust in the background, but it's making these fruity bodies. These are, the fungal mushrooms essentially, and they're shooting out spores, and those spores will fly around until they find a new a new partner. You can't, just those spores are only fungal. They're not, they won't take the other partners along with them. Another one that's a common species in the Arctic that are in the prairies and the Arctic. I did want to point out just that a lot of my research has been focused on the Arctic, and it's been kind of interesting to make a link that I think people were kind of dialed into, but just to see how strong the link is between the high Arctic and the prairies. And the two have a very, very similar communities of lichens. They, a lot of these species are jumping over the temperate, jumping over the boreal, jumping over the southern Arctic, and showing up in the Arctic, which is extremely dry. It's the conditions, it feels like you're in the prairies in some ways, or vice versa, and the conditions are the same, and the lichens are reflecting that. So what it's showing us then is that light is not so much of a factor, but it's more of the dryness, the precipitation, or that's allowing these lichens to grow in these 2 different environments. So this is a very common one this is the one I mentioned that went up to the space station. That's a nitrophile that it gets a lot of its nitrogen from bird roosts. It's a very common lichen, and it's really show-stopping. Probably the #1 lichen. When people send me lichens that they notice, of course, you're going to notice this bright orange thing, but there's all these amazing lichens here. There's this little pale yellow one. There's little black dots there. This is one over here is a Acarospora. There's a lot going on in the rocks, but so they're not always all bright and showy like that. But because there are ones like that, they often take center stage. This is called the tile lichen, another widespread species growing on rocks in the Arctic and in the prairies. This is a very common prairie species, green rock posy, and it has usnic acid, the acid that I mentioned at the beginning that is used as an antibacterial, and it gives it that yellow-green color. And so the discs of this one are kind of a darkish color. I don't know if you call that black or dark green, or it separates it from other similar. This is another species in that genus, also has usnic acid in it, but its discs are orange. And so these are some of the ways that we separate lichens. But you can also see the communities that grow around it. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 or 6 different lichens just on this picture. This is a really common one in the prairies. It's like the center of diversity for this genus is in the prairie ecosystem. And also, well, there's more species in the prairies, but there's a few of them, including this one, that are very common in the high Arctic again. It just makes like a yellow crust. It's part of the biocrust layer on soil in the prairies. Another very common one in the prairies is called golden moonglow lichen. It's one of my favorites. It actually has fuchsinic acid as well, giving it that yellow-green color. And it's got black fruiting bodies. They're very minute, but these will cover big areas of on the rocks sometimes. It's really beautiful lichen with a great name. This is yellow map lichen. This one also stands out because it's so bright, and it often gets lumped into this one genus. If people see it, they say, oh, that's yellow map lichen, that's Rhizocarpum geographicum. There's actually about 10 species that are yellow, that are extremely similar. So you have to cut these one. If you want to actually figure out what species it is, you have to collect it and cut open one of these little black fruiting bodies and see what's happening inside. It's the color of the spores, the size of the spores, and other characters. This is an orange one that grows in the prairies on calcareous areas. And this one is endosubstratic. It means it grows, the body of it is inside the substrate. So you only see the fruiting bodies popping up. And so if you're just seeing these little orange dots, these are the fruiting bodies of the lichen, which is actually below the surface. These are called fire dots, the fire dot lichens. This is a cyanolichen. That'll give you an example of that, which are also common on calcareous areas in the prairies. And the cyanolichens, again, are the ones that are fixing nitrogen. So when water hits it, it's washing nitrogen into the soil. And this is a common one in the prairies that is often overlooked. This is a very fertile one. It often has no fruiting bodies, and it just has this dark body, and it really blends in with the soil, and these ones get overlooked often. I just really like this one. This is a common one that grows on calcareous rock in the prairie environments. It's called hidden gold speck lichen. These little tiny yellow dots, I pointed them out earlier. They're a fraction of a millimeter, half a millimeter maybe, and they're really hard to see until you zoom in, and this incredible world emerges. I call this getting your lichen eyes. Once you start noticing these incredible organisms, you just can't stop seeing them. They're everywhere. They grow on everything. They grow on the trees in your front yard. They grow on the rocks, the sidewalks. They're everywhere, and they're just an incredible life form. Another common one growing on calcareous rock in prairie ecosystems. And then these are some of the ones that grow in shrubs in the area. So just the small trees and plants, you'll often find a species of Physia. This is a common one out there, Physia stellaris. This is another Physia that grows on rock, and you can see those fire dot lichens growing down beside it. Another one growing, this is another Physia that grows on trees and shrubs, common in the prairies. You can see the candle flame lichen growing in amongst it as well. This is a crustose lichen that's growing into the substrate of the rocks in the prairies. And this one you can actually get to genus very easily by putting a drop of water on. It has kind of this smoky-eyed look. It's a crystallization of the chemical that's inside. And if you put a drop of water on it, the crystallization disappears, and you get these kind of a red-brown coloration showing, which is actually the color of these fruiting bodies, but they're being covered by the chemical. Other big classic prairie / Arctic species that grow on the soil, usually on calcareous soil, are these blushing scales and Placidium squamulosum, these dark brown ones that grow amongst it. If you get down right into the soil, these are pretty common species to find growing on the soil in the prairies. But none of the lichens do well when it comes to agriculture. Lichens take an incredible amount of time to find an area, to colonize an area, and start growing. And once they start growing, they're extremely slow. They're extremely sensitive to disturbance. They're really sensitive to any kind of spraying, any kind of pesticides, any kind of chemicals, any kind of mechanical disturbance from being trampled on, driven over, made into agriculture. So they take a long time to get there, and they're indicators of disturbance. You won't find many species in disturbed areas. But they are hardy. This is an example of one that survived a fire that came through. It's still alive, it's still there, got crisped up a little bit, but it'll probably be fine and keep growing. So there's still lots to learn. There's lots to learn about lichens across Canada. It's we're way behind where vascular plants are. It's still easy to find new species to Canada, new species to science, and the prairies are one of the areas that are not all that explored, and there's still lots to learn about them. I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks for having me on again.
Thank you. I know you came back. We had so many people that were asking for it. I just had to ask you to come back and and give us another presentation. So really, by popular demand.
I know. I wish I could be there in person. It's so hard to
yeah.
just stare at a screen and hope somebody's listening out there.
Well, we actually have a lot of people listening. I think there's been over 100 people that have came in so far, and we've got 15 questions already. So if you're okay, I can just start with kind of our most popular questions and go from there. So the first question, how many lichen species are on the prairies?
That is unknown right now. So
can you give us a
I actually have a
ballpark?
student a master's student who's enumerating what's in Dinosaur Provincial Park in Alberta right now. And we have this study from, so we can know what little pockets are, but what the total one is, that hasn't been done yet. No one's summarized like that as a very worthy project for anyone out there. It's to summarize, okay, like what species are growing in the prairies. We still don't have that baseline information, and what species are rare. I mean, until we figure that out, we can't figure out which ones we should be giving our conservation attention to.
Yeah. Wow. So how long do lichens live?
That's a good question. So this one was the oldest one aged that we know of, and properly, and it was over 8,000 years old. It was growing in the Arctic, which in many ways has similar conditions to the prairies, where things, those are places that species grow the slowest. And we know that, like there's been lots of studies that have marked how fast lichens are growing. Some of them have been like over the last 100 years, like how fast is this thing growing? And there's actually a whole science behind it. There's departments that study lichenometry. So you can, when a glacier pulls back and the lichen starts growing, you can say how long ago, at least, there was not a glacier there. You don't know when it was colonized necessarily, but you can actually judge how fast it grew. So in many cases, like in the Arctic, species like this won't grow at all one year. And next year they might grow 0.1 millimeters. Next year they might grow 0.2. Like they're, in the more extreme environments, they grow incredibly slowly.
Okay. So how does one age a lichen?
Oh, good question. And usually, I've aged them a few times. I've been working on a project where I've been pulling lichens out from underneath glaciers, like in glacial till, to see how old they are and I've been looking at them to see if they're actually still alive and see how old they are. And I've been sending them off for carbon dating. And so I just send them to a carbon dating lab, and they're able to tell within a very small range how old they are.
Okay. And can lichens tell you anything else, for example, about past climate, like how tree rings can be used for that?
Well, so this fellow, John McCown, one of my big research projects has been, I call it McCown's receding lichen line. So when you have a baseline, you can tell when things are changing, right? But if you don't have a baseline, you can't say, oh, climate change is affecting the things here, if you don't know what was there. So it's really important that we have these inventories. Like I would really love to have a nice summary of the prairies, and like what, like this would be a wonderful PhD project, to go to all these, sites where there's still intact areas of prairie ecosystem and figure out what lichens are there, because they're so abundant and so dominant in those areas. We should know what is there. So I've been studying areas where John McCown had found interesting lichens, interesting being rare, sensitive lichens, and where they are today. And in many cases, you can track development, you can track air pollution, you can track all these things that are moving them to their current state. So I call it McCown's receding lichen line. And it's just So we do it. So it's wonderful in the prairies. It could be an amazing master's project to go say, okay, well, John McCown collected all these things. Let's go back to all those sites and see where they are. And if they're not there, where are they? And like where's the next nearest one?
Yeah, fascinating. That'd be really
Yeah.
neat. So our next question from Elizabeth, she says, I would like to learn if there is a way to grow lichen in my garden. Is there a gardening technique to grow or encourage lichen?
Um, yes, you can, but it's I've encountered this time and time again, and they're so sensitive, and they're so
Mm,
one of the reasons that there's so many lichens is because they fill ecological niches perfectly, right? Like there's some that will only grow on on a certain type of tree, a certain species of tree, and only on a certain age of like the branches, and only when those branches are over water. Like they can be so specific and hyper, like so if you can replicate those conditions, but they're also eating the nutrients that are washing by, right? You've got to replicate the rain, you've got to replicate everything to make the conditions right. So there are lichens. I was saying like those ones are the most specific, but like host specific or habitat specific. But there are ones that are more ubiquitous. So if you learn which ones are more widespread and are more tolerant to growing on different things, then you can grow them for sure. And so really you're doing a transplant experiment. You're saying how well can these transplant? So the first thing to do is to maybe find out what species grow in similar habitats that are in your garden. So like which ones are in the same, zone for planting a garden, which ones are really abundant, and then will they grow on the right substrate? And so you can inoculate easily. You can, a lot of them reproduce by fragmentation and just rubbing
mm.
spores or rubbing some species on an area, and sometimes it works for sure. I know people who have had success, and lots of people who have not had success. So yes is the answer, but it's difficult.
Okay. Is there any modeling that show the difference within a watershed for water capture with lichen compared to a watershed without lichen?
I would love to see that study. There has been studies that really just focus directly on the water that's been like the fact that they are like the percentage of water that they're giving back to an ecosystem. They're slowly releasing this water, like and sometimes they're pretty abundant, like they're coating trees and coating the ground, and like that's a lot of moisture to then slowly release back into the environment. So I mean, it'd be a difficult task to do to find two equally comparable habitats, that one that has lichens and one that doesn't, but it's not impossible. I mean, you could do that. I mean, I did a study in Ontario along the escarpment where I just took a plot of land within cities all along, like I did at Owen Sound and Niagara Falls and Hamilton. I did a plot that was virtually like in all ways that I could make the soil the same, the rocks the same, the tree age, type, all the same. And I did a plot in the city and a plot out of the city, and then looked at the diversity, and the diversity was clearly higher outside of the city, unsurprisingly, because lichens are sensitive to air pollution. So you could do the same, but I have not seen a study like that.
Okay. Do lichens exude any minerals or nutrients or compounds that they do not require or are toxins?
Well, there's that yellow lichen that I showed that is known to be toxic,
Yeah.
and so there's 1,000 chemicals, but very few of them are known to be toxic in any way. But we have a really hard time digesting them. So the
Okay.
Scott expedition in the polar regions that we were having troubles wrote about eating rock tripe, and said that, oh, they'd rather eat the leather on their boots over rock tripe because rock tripe was giving them the run so bad. And so you can eat these things. I don't recommend it. One, because, well, when it comes to lichens, most of them are rare. Like there's a few species that are really abundant, but most, like, rarity is common and commonality is rare. So a small number of species make up the bulk of what you see, and then there's really small number of species are of diversity. All the diversity is packed into a small area. So a lot of them are rare. So I don't recommend eating them. But if you eat one of the common ones, no big deal. But you have to know how to prepare it, right? So the different people around the world have been eating lichens for a long time. You have to know, there's a lot of processes where you're boiling it and changing the water, and boiling it again, and then changing the water. And then, or there's some species that don't have it. Like there's a big brown hairy one in BC that has been used forever to make bread and that, because it doesn't have any of these harsh secondary compounds. So you have to know your lichen and know how to prepare it, and you can eat it. You also always have to be cautious because they're sponges. So if there's air pollution out there, they're sucking in that air pollution. Like they're really sensitive and strong bioindicators and bioaccumulators of air pollution, acid rain. So
Okay.
long-winded answer. It's complicated.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Next question from Catherine. If a lichen species could survive a year and a half in space without water or air, could lichen that have been plowed or buried survive underground and perhaps return to life in the future?
Great question. And that's exactly what when I mentioned I'm going to be pulling out lichens from till underneath glaciers. That's my hypothesis, that they don't need to recolonize when glaciers disappear. They're already there and they keep going. So I am actually
Oh,
finding lichens that are like 300 years old that have been under a glacier for 300 years. And when the glacier retreats and they're exposed, they're still alive. Some of them are still alive. So so it's not necessarily a recolonization. It is, they were already there. And so, yeah, in the right conditions, in those cases, they're probably being, there's the fact that it's so cold. Could they survive underground? It would all depend on the conditions, I guess. When I collect a lichen and I want to do DNA work on it, you can only really do that for about 5 years before the DNA is no longer good. And to me, that's about when they must be dying. And so, if conditions are normal, you've probably got 5 years for them to, on average, to stay alive. But if you can like freeze them or keep them in some kind of state of protection, it will be longer.
so cool.
Yeah.
Evolutionary, how far back do lichens go?
Well, the lichens we know today go back to, we have fossil records and evidence going back to the Jurassic period.
Okay.
Most fossils are coming from the Paleozoic area. Most of them are in resin. So there's a lot of resin ones that we found new species that never made it to our time period. We found some of the ones we know today still in that resin. So that's where most of the lichens that we know of have come from. But the oldest ones that seem to be really lichenized, like you're actually seeing algae layers and that sort of thing, were from 450 million years ago, making them extremely old. And then 600 million years ago, there's evidence of fungi and a photobiont like working together, not in the way that we see today, but there's a deep fossil record for sure.
Wow, that's really neat. Um, and another listener is wondering, are amateur lichenologists able to acquire KOH for ID purposes in Canada?
Yeah, KOH is one that you can order from chemical supply companies, and they will send it to individuals. But if they won't, you can use it's potassium hydroxide. You can use household lye, whatever that chemical is, as an alternative. It works the same way. So you can get that from a hardware store if you
Okay.
can't get it from a chemical supplier. So the hard one to get is there's 3 main chemicals used to study lichens. And their acronyms in all the books, and that are C, which is just bleach you can go buy. It's KOH, which as I just explained, but then there's PD as well, which is paraphenyldiamine. And you can get that. That is very difficult to get. You cannot order that from a chemical supplier. So unless you're working for an institution, it's unlikely you can get that one, but the other 2 you can.
Okay. And Mary Lou says, somebody showed me what they called nostoc species, and it's black when dry, and then it became jelly like when it was wet. And she said we were walking through an open field in Regina, and I saw this lichen in Medicine Hat. Do you know if that's the correct name by chance?
Yeah, nostoc, free living nostoc is really abundant and common, and it sounds just like you described. It's sort of this like scraggly, jelly. It's dry and hard, and it just looks unhealthy. It looks like kind of dead. And then when you wet it, it gets very slimy and jelly-like. Um, and that is what free living nostoc looks like. But that nostoc is in a lot of lichens. Most of this, it's the most common photobiont in cyanolichens. And so often in that environment, you'll find a lot of other lichens that have cyanobacteria when you see free living nostoc around.
Okay, awesome. That's really neat. Thank you. Um,
Mhm.
what is the most understudied aspect of lichens and lichenal ecology in the prairies?
Oh, in the prairies, I mean, I think we're still just learning the baseline, and that's the
Wow.
biggest thing. We still don't know, you know, there's been no, besides that one golden eye one, like we haven't been able to say which ones are rare. Like we definitely have rare species in the prairies that are, very prairie specific or prairie slash high Arctic specific. And but it hasn't been enumerated. Like this is like where plants were 100 years ago. Like we still need to know what species are there as our first thing. And so in terms of their ecology and that, like what we need to learn, that's so varied. There's so many different questions you can ask and answer about lichens. But I think the biggest thing is, I mean, what really drives me in this field is conservation. Lichens really tell us a lot about like different ecosystems, what ecosystems are rare. They tell us a lot about how ecosystems are working, how health, like the health, if you want to call it that, like and so I'm really dialed into how to use them for conservation purposes. And so when we don't know what species are where and what species are rare, it's really hard to say much about them.
Hmm.
That's what I think we need more of.
That sounds good. I know we're kind of out of time here, but before we go, can you tell us about your lichen books?
Sure. Well, the most recent one is the one that it would apply heavily in the Prairie region. It's a comprehensive guide to the lichens of all the macro lichens of Ontario. So there's almost 500 species in there, and it includes everything. So if you're in Ontario, you find a lichen in that book. There's keys to all of them. There's photos. There's about almost 800 photos in it. And it's the first book of its type for Canada, where there's a comprehensive guide. There's been lots of books. Like my predecessor wrote a big book on the lichens of North America, and that was a real door opener for a lot of people to get into lichens. But he focused on the common ones, and as I said, the common ones make up the bulk of what you see, but the vast majority of the diversity is in the things you don't see.
Mm.
And so that book covered like the prairies, the Arctic, the tropics in Florida, the mountains, the rainforests, the deserts. And so there's a lot to wade through. So this is the first time we have a book that is totally comprehensive with photos in Canada where you can key things out well and feel like, okay, it's going to be in here if it's in there. So of course, there's going to be a lot of overlap with what's in the prairies. But we should, I mean, ideally, there will be one for the prairies one day as well.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds like a great resource. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the amazing presentation again. We love lichens over here. We just can't get enough of them. People we see lichen every day, right? So it's always been interesting. And there's, like you said, we just don't know much. So thank you so much for the fabulous presentation today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Next time, maybe we can do it in person.
Yes, let us know if you're ever in
Yeah,
Saskatchewan and we will set
very
that
much
up.
interested. Okay, thanks,
Awesome.
guys.
Thank you. Well, thanks so
Take
much,
care.
everyone, for catching today's webinar. Be sure to check out, we have another webinar tomorrow about research in the prairies. Also, we have one about kind of migratory birds at Red Berry Lake happening in July. So when you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey if you don't mind filling that out. We really appreciate we can report back to our sponsors and funders and keep our speaker series going into the future. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.